Well, hi. Here is the PowerPoint that I promised in my previous video. And as I said, we'll be talking about historiography and historical interpretation. So this is meant to set you up for the semester ahead and some concepts that I'll be looking at with you and helping you understand as we work through our reading materials, the lectures, and the other activities that you'll participate in this semester. And so to start with, let's talk about the lesson objectives for this video and this PowerPoint today. So I want you to come away from this with a comprehension of why studying history is important to understanding ourselves and the world around us. And I want you to also understand the historical approach, how historians craft history, the work that goes into creating historical accounts and narratives, and how we approach that, the work that we do. And I also want you to know the differences between primary and secondary sources. Now, I'm hoping that you have some understanding of what those are, but in this lesson today, we'll review that just to get you prepared for the semester ahead. So let's talk a little bit about what is history. I brought that up in the previous lecture, and I want to bring some quotes here for you to contemplate and think about as you consider the question, what is history? Now, I'm not going to give you a definitive answer. My idea of what history is, as I said before, centers around change over time. So for me, that's a working concept that I use when I think about what is history. It's change over time. But here's some great quotes to kind of get you thinking about that. History is the witness that testifies to the passing of time. It illuminates reality, vitalizes memory, provides guidance in daily life, and brings us tidings of antiquity. And so that was Cicero. Here's another quote by historian Edward Gibbon. History is, indeed, little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. So maybe you'll find a quote as we go through here that kind of speaks to you, that you might want to talk about in our discussion forum. Maybe you have a quote that you've found in the past that you think adequately describes what is history and you'd like to share. So Napoleon said, "History is a myth we all agree to believe." History is a myth we all agree to believe. Henry Ford. We'll learn a little bit more about Henry Ford in the early part of this semester. He said, "History is more or less bunk." Ramon Gomez de la Serna, "History is something that never happened, told by someone who wasn't there." So that's an interesting way to think about history. So what is history? Another quote. "History deals not only with the lives of great individuals, it may be said to consist of the sediment of the lives of millions of smaller men and women who have left no name, but who have made their contribution." And so that's really important to think about the idea, the sediment, the smaller lives, the people that maybe we haven't heard from, the voices that don't make it into the textbooks or the history books. Who tells their story? What is their story? Why study history? So maybe we can agree on what is history. Maybe we can't. Maybe there's multiple definitions. But why? So why study it? What is the purpose? Livy once said, "The study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind. For in history you have a record of the infinite variety of human experience plainly set out for all to see, and in that record you can find yourself and your country both examples and warnings, the fine things to take as models, base things, rotten through and through, to avoid." So perhaps history is a way for us to understand our present moment by looking at the past, and maybe we can do things better this time, or maybe we can't. Shakespeare, The Past is Prologue. Winston Churchill, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. This is a very popular quote. You may have heard that one before. So again, I ask you, why study history? Is there a good reason? There are human truths to be derived from history, and truths well worth the telling, some large, some small, some general, some technical. Some, if not the most important of the problems which face society today, are not new ones. The purpose of historical investigation is to produce answers in the form of concepts and generalizations to the fundamental problems of historical change in the social activities of men. So there's a lot of things in there we can kind of pull apart and look at. In particular, I want to call your attention to the word truths. Human truths, some large, some small, some general, some technical. What are the truths and how do we get to them? Is it okay to make generalizations? Can we think of history in any way other than generalizations? There are so many people and so many stories. Could we tell specific stories, or do we need a generalization? So those are questions for you to keep on pondering. What is history and why study history? And I'm interested, as we go through this semester, what your answers are. Do they change? Do they change over time as you take this course? So let's focus on the historical approach, how historians do history. How can we understand anything of other people or ourselves if we know nothing of history? The historian shows us how change has worked in the past and helps us understand the present and make educated guesses about the future. So if we know what happened in the past, there's a chance we could use that to help us understand what's happening now and what might potentially happen in the future. Of course, there's limits to that knowledge. Historiography. This is the writing of history. So the way history has been written, the way the stories have been told. Historians, we vary widely in what we feel is significant and important about the past. So I bring my own kind of ways of looking at the world into my research. So things that interest me might not interest other historians, and so I may tend to focus on different aspects. So each historian does write a little different, does their research a little different. And as students of history, you need to learn and understand how different historians write history and the sources that they use to write that history. Now, I talked in the previous slide a little bit about truth and how to get to the truth of the matter. Well, that starts with having sources that are vetted, sources that are valid, and that sometimes is hard to find, especially when you're looking on the internet. You may come across information that looks legitimate but isn't necessarily the truth, or maybe not the whole truth. So hopefully this semester you'll learn a little bit more about how to check sources and how to make sure they're legitimate. So you need to understand the historian and the sources that they're using to substantiate their claim. And you also need to understand for yourself how to find sources and how to kind of back up your own arguments. So students of history must examine not only the past, but those who write about it. So it's been said that you should study the historian before you begin to study the facts. This semester, the two historians we'll be focusing on most closely are Howard Zinn and Paul Johnson, and I'll ask you to pay particular attention to the sources that they're using, and those sources will be listed in the back of the book, and you can check those sources for yourself. In fact, you may come across some of the same sources in the reader in our For the Record, which is our primary source reader, and Johnson may use a source that you have in here, or Zinn may use a source, and their interpretation may be a little bit different than the way that you read the primary source. So it's helpful for you to understand that historians construct stories based on their own ideas about the primary sources that they are reading. So finding the facts, that's becoming more and more difficult the more facts that we're exposed to, and all of you have grown up in this age, or most of you have probably grown up in the age of computers where we have access to information 24/7 and pretty much Google anything. But what are facts and what facts are important? So not only having access to all of the information that we have, you have to know what questions to ask, how to weed through all of that information to what is most relevant. The historian investigates facts and selects relevant ones. So you'll be doing the work of a historian this semester, and you'll be charged with selecting facts and deciding for yourself which ones are relevant to the story. This is an art and not a science. So there's no one formula. There's no one way that everybody must do it. In interpreting facts and finding information, it's imperative that you understand and to identify bias. So bias is the slant that one puts on things, and it can be deliberate or it could be unintentional. And we all have our kind of inherent bias for things. We prefer certain things, maybe we exclude certain things without even knowing it. And please keep in mind that all writing contains bias. So be on the lookout for it. It can be very quiet. You might not notice it. It can be very blatant. It might be right in your face and something you can't ignore. Try to identify it by looking for the types of words used. And so we'll talk about that in some of the writings with Zinn and Johnson and the ways that they structure the story and the words that they use. And how do they use those words to influence or shape or maybe tell you a little bit about what their biases are. And every age contains its own bias. Every decade, every generation has a certain way of understanding and looking at the world that can be biased. These make understanding past thinking very difficult. So we're going to talk about some difficult issues looking at racial discrimination and segregation in America, and in the generations that include some of these biases that have changed in some ways and not changed in others. And so each age contains its own biases, and sometimes they're passed on and we don't even know it. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we'll be identifying biases this semester. We'll also look at identifying important and answerable questions. Very important that you understand how to ask a question, and any question that you want to ask. That I will put an open invitation for you and tell you that there are no stupid questions. I don't believe in stupid questions because every question is valid, and I love questions because that is what drives people to continue to find answers and look into the past, and so the more questions the better. To answer the questions, though, I will say that you must select your sources critically. Just don't accept any source that you come across. Don't accept the first hit on Google because it's the first hit. And for this class, your topics need to be limited. So you're going to have many, many questions about lots of different ideas that crop up. But in order for you to really keep it within the parameters of the 20th century, you